There is a certain kind of quiet that only exists inside a bakery before the rest of the world wakes up. It is not the quiet of emptiness. It is the quiet of purpose. The kind of quiet that hums underneath the sound of dough being pressed flat on a wooden board, underneath the low groan of an old oven warming itself up, underneath the soft shuffle of slippers on a tile floor that has seen better days but still holds its ground. That is the quiet that lived inside Haruto's bakery every single morning, and on most days, that quiet was enough to make him feel like everything was going to be okay. Seiji Haruto was 28 years old and he had already lived through enough pain to fill a much longer life. He was not a tall man, not a loud man, not the kind of man who walked into a room and made people turn their heads. He was the kind of man who kept things warm. The kind of man who remembered how you liked your coffee and made it that way without being asked. The kind of man who held things together so gently that the things he was holding never even realized they had once been broken. He wore the same white apron every morning, the one with the little flour stain near the pocket that never fully washed out no matter how many times he tried. His hands were always slightly dry from the work, his hair always a little messy before noon, and his eyes, dark and quiet and deep as still water, always carried just a little more tiredness than someone his age should have had to carry. But he carried it. That was the thing about Haruto. He always carried it. The bakery was small. It sat on the corner of a narrow street in a neighborhood that was not rich or fancy but was the kind of place where people knew each other's names and left soup outside each other's doors when someone got sick. The sign above the door said Haruto's in crooked hand-painted letters because he had painted it himself the day he opened, and his hands had been shaking from excitement and his ladder had been slightly too short and the result was charming in the way that honest things always are. Inside, there were 4 small tables with mismatched chairs, a glass display case that fogged up on cold mornings, shelves lined with bread that smelled like something a grandmother would make, and in the very back corner, behind the counter and just beside the oven, there was a small chair. A tiny chair, red with a little white cushion that had a cartoon bear on it. That chair had not been bought for the bakery. That chair had been bought for Sora. Sora was 3 years old and he was the single greatest thing that had ever happened to Seiji Haruto. He was round-cheeked and serious-faced in the way that very small children sometimes are, the kind of child who looked at things with enormous concentrated eyes like he was trying to understand the entire universe through the specific object he was staring at. He had his father's dark hair and a laugh that sounded like something bubbling over and he called Haruto Papa in a voice so soft it could have melted stone. Every morning, Haruto would settle Sora into the little red chair with a piece of bread or a small bowl of something soft, and Sora would sit there very importantly, kicking his legs back and forth, watching his father work like he was watching the most interesting show in the world. That morning was the same as every other morning in the way that mornings tend to be before they suddenly are not. Haruto was working with the bread dough, pressing and folding and turning it in the way that his hands knew by memory now, not needing instructions or measurements anymore, just the feel of it. The oven was already warm. The first trays were already in. The street outside was gray and wet, the kind of cold rain that did not fall loudly but simply existed everywhere all at once, coating everything in quiet silver. Sora was in his red chair. He had already eaten his bread. He was now holding Haruto's old phone, the spare one that Haruto left near the counter because it still connected to the bakery Wi-Fi and had games on it that kept Sora busy during slow hours. Sora could not read. He could not type. He could barely operate the phone beyond pressing things and watching what happened, which was, in the way of all very small children, exactly enough to cause something enormous. Haruto did not see what Sora was doing. He was thinking about the bread. He was thinking about whether he needed to order more butter that week. He was thinking about 100 small and ordinary things the way a person does when they are trying very hard not to think about the one large and extraordinary thing that lives quietly in the back of their chest like a stone they have learned to breathe around. He was not thinking about Daichi. He was almost never thinking about Daichi. He was always thinking about Daichi. Sora had found the contacts list without meaning to. He had been trying to find the dinosaur game and had pressed too many things and arrived somewhere unexpected, which again, in the way of very small children, did not bother him at all. He scrolled with one small finger the way he had seen his papa do. He did not know what the word said. He could not read the name. But he could see the little picture beside the contact, the small round photo of a face, and that face he knew. He knew that face the way he knew his papa's voice in a crowd. He knew that face the way he knew that the red chair was his chair and the bakery smell meant safe and the sound of the oven meant morning. He knew that face because it was stored somewhere deeper than memory, in the part of a small child that simply keeps what it loves and does not let go regardless of time or silence or absence. Sora pressed the voice message button. He held the phone up close to his mouth the way he had seen grown-ups do. And then in his small, unhurried, completely certain voice, he spoke. He said that he missed him. He said that Papa had made bread and it smelled really good. He said come home. He said it the way children say things that adults spend years trying to find the words for, simply and without decoration, as if the truth was obvious and the only strange thing was that it needed to be said at all. Then he put the phone down and went back to looking for the dinosaur game. He had sent it before Haruto ever turned around. Across the city, in an office that was cold in the way that expensive things are sometimes cold, all glass and clean lines and nothing soft anywhere, Nakamura Daichi was sitting at a desk that was too large for one person and staring at nothing. Daichi was 31 years old and he looked, to everyone who saw him, like a man who had everything. He was broad-shouldered and composed, the kind of person whose stillness read as authority, whose silence read as control. He wore his suits like armor and he had learned a long time ago how to keep his face so steady that no one could tell what was happening underneath it. He ran a significant portion of his family's company. He was respected. He was efficient. He was, by every visible measure, completely fine. He was not fine. He had not been fine in a year. He had been performing fine with such consistency and discipline that some days he almost convinced himself, but the performance always cracked somewhere around 2 in the morning when the office was empty and the city outside the window was dark and quiet and there was nothing left to do and nothing left to manage and nothing left to be except a man sitting alone in a very large room that echoed. His phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at it with the particular disinterest of someone who has been receiving messages all day and has answered all of them correctly and does not particularly want another one. The notification showed a voice message. The number was not saved. He almost did not press it. He pressed it. And then the voice came through the speaker and it was small and round and certain and it said Daddy, and Daichi stopped breathing. He did not move. He did not look away from the phone. He simply sat completely still while that little voice filled the cold office and said things that were so simple and so devastating that the careful, composed, unreachable face he had been wearing for 12 months cracked completely open in the empty room where no one could see it. He listened to it twice. Then a third time. His hand around the phone was shaking. He did not notice. He pressed play again and sat in the shaking and the silence and the sound of a 3-year-old boy who still remembered him, who had kept him in the category of daddy as naturally as breathing, who had picked up a phone in a bakery on a rainy morning and said come home like it was the most reasonable request in the world. Because to Sora it was. Children do not understand the complicated architecture of adult failures. They do not understand betrayal or pride or the way a person can be so afraid of being hurt that they destroy the very thing they were afraid of losing. Sora only understood that there was a person he loved and that person was not there, and that seemed like something that could simply be fixed by asking. Daichi sat in his cold glass office for a very long time. Outside the rain continued. Inside the bakery on the corner of that narrow street, Haruto turned from the oven and saw his old phone sitting on the counter. He picked it up to move it and the screen lit up. He saw the sent message notification. He saw the contact name. The blood left his face slowly, the way warmth leaves a room when a window opens in winter. His best friend Fumiya arrived 7 minutes later with 2 coffees and a bag of sesame crackers and stopped in the doorway when he saw Haruto sitting on the floor behind the counter with his back against the cabinet and his knees pulled up and his eyes staring at the phone in his hands like it had said something in a language he used to speak and had spent a year trying to forget. The bread in the oven was starting to burn. Neither of them noticed. People who are very good at pretending to be fine are also, almost always, very good at recognizing when someone else is doing the same thing. Fumiya had known Haruto for 6 years. He had known him through the small joys and the ordinary hard days and the 1 year that did not deserve a polite name, the year that Haruto never talked about directly but that lived in the careful way he smiled now, just a half-second slower than it used to be, like his face had forgotten the automatic version and had to find the manual one each time. Fumiya had watched his best friend rebuild himself from something that had been scattered completely, watched him open that bakery wider every morning like a person proving something to no one in particular, watched him tuck Sora in at night and then sit alone at the kitchen table with cold tea and eyes that were looking at something that was not in the room. Fumiya had never once said you are not okay. He had simply kept showing up with coffee, which was its own kind of language. But sitting on the bakery floor with his knees pulled to his chest and his eyes fixed on a phone screen, Haruto looked like a version of himself that Fumiya had hoped was retired. The burned bread smell reached them both at the same time. Fumiya put down the coffees, walked around the counter, pulled the tray from the oven with the cloth hanging by the handle, set it aside, and then sat down on the floor beside Haruto without being asked. He did not say anything. He waited. Haruto showed him the phone. Fumiya read the notification. He looked at the contact name. He looked at the sent timestamp. He looked at Sora, who was now completely unbothered in his red chair, finally successful in finding the dinosaur game, making small explosion sounds with his mouth. Fumiya said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Oh Sora." Not with anger. Not with alarm. With the particular exhausted tenderness of someone who understood completely why a 3-year-old had done what a 3-year-old had done and also understood completely why that single voice note had detonated like something quiet and irreversible inside a bakery on an otherwise ordinary rainy morning. Haruto said nothing. He was still looking at the screen. The message had been delivered. It had been read. There was a small read receipt beneath it, 2 words that somehow managed to be both completely neutral and completely unbearable. 3 days passed. Haruto got up every morning. He made the bread. He settled Sora in the red chair. He served the regular customers who came in for their usual orders and who noticed nothing different because Haruto was very good at the performance, just as he had always been. He laughed at the right moments. He remembered the names of people's children and asked about them. He kept the display case full and the floor swept and the sign in the window turned to open at exactly the right time. At night he lay very still in the dark and did not sleep until very late. He told himself this was fine. He told himself that one voice note from a 3-year-old did not undo a year of careful distance. He told himself that Daichi not responding was actually the better outcome, that silence was cleaner than whatever the alternative might have been, that he had built something good here in this small bakery on this narrow street and a red receipt on an old phone was not going to touch any of it. He almost believed himself. On the other side of the city, Daichi was not sleeping either. He was doing something that he had not allowed himself to do in 12 months. He was thinking carefully and honestly about the night everything ended, pulling it out of the locked place he had kept it and looking at it with the kind of attention he had refused to give it at the time. At the time he had been too angry and too hurt and too convinced to look carefully at anything. He had looked at the photos Ryosuke showed him and he had felt the old familiar collapse of a person who had always believed, somewhere deep and unexamined, that love was something that would eventually be taken from him, and that collapse had felt so much like confirmation that he had not questioned it at all. He questioned it now. He was not a careless man. He was precise and methodical, and when he turned those qualities on the memory of that night, small things began to surface that he had drowned deliberately at the time because they had been inconvenient to the story he had already decided was true. Haruto's face. He kept coming back to Haruto's face. He had seen that face for 2 years. He knew every version of it. He knew the face Haruto made when he was tired and pretending not to be, knew the face he made when he was worried about something small, knew the face he made when he was genuinely happy, which was a different thing from when he was performing happy, though most people could not tell the difference. Daichi had always been able to tell the difference. The face Haruto had made that night was not the face of someone who had been caught. It was the face of someone who had been ambushed by something that made no sense. It was shock layered over confusion layered over a specific kind of pain that only comes from being accused of something by someone whose opinion is the one that matters most to you. Daichi had seen that face and called it guilt because guilt had been the explanation he needed. He hired someone quietly. A careful private investigator who asked few questions and produced clean documentation. Within 8 days the documentation arrived and Daichi sat at his large empty desk and read through it with the steadiness of a man who has already begun to suspect the ground beneath him is hollow and is simply waiting to find out how deep the drop is. The photos Ryosuke had shown him were dated. The dates placed Haruto at a location across the city on an afternoon that the bakery records, the payment system logs, 3 customer receipts, and a delivery confirmation all placed Haruto solidly behind his own counter. The photos were not from that day. The metadata, which the investigator had extracted and documented with precise technical notes, showed the images had been taken on a different date entirely and the timestamps had been altered. The man in the photos with Haruto was found without much difficulty. He was a minor actor of no particular success who had taken a paid job from an anonymous contact and had been told only to stand near a specific person in a specific location on a specific day and allow photographs to be taken. He had signed a short contract. The contact information on that contract traced back, through 2 intermediary accounts, to a personal device registered to Ryosuke. Daichi closed the folder. He sat with it for a long time. Outside the window, the city was going about its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the fact that a man was sitting very still at a large desk, understanding, with total clarity, that he had destroyed his own life with his own hands because someone he had trusted had handed him a lie and he had been too afraid and too broken to put it down. He called Ryosuke and invited him to dinner. His voice on the phone was warm and easy and completely ordinary. He mentioned a restaurant they both liked. He said it had been too long. He said they should catch up. Ryosuke agreed immediately, pleasantly, with the confidence of a person who has no idea that the room he is walking into has a different shape than the one he remembers. The dinner was unremarkable for most of its duration. They talked about the company. They talked about a cousin's upcoming wedding. They ordered well and ate without rushing, and Daichi laughed at 2 of Ryosuke's stories in a way that was convincing because Daichi had always been a very controlled person, and control, when turned in this particular direction, was indistinguishable from warmth. Then Daichi set down his fork. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He placed a folder on the table between the plates. Ryosuke looked at it. He looked at Daichi. Something moved across his face, quick and small, the first honest expression he had produced all evening. Daichi did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply spoke in the low, even tone of a man who has already decided what happens next and does not need agreement from anyone in the room. He said what Ryosuke had done. He said it completely and in order. He named the photos, the actor, the contract, the accounts, the device. He named the reason, which was the company position Ryosuke had gained in the months after Haruto left, when Daichi had been too gutted and distracted to pay proper attention to internal movements. He named the cost, which was a family that no longer existed and a little boy who had spent a year waiting for someone who did not come. Ryosuke tried to speak twice. Daichi continued both times as if the interruption had not occurred, which was somehow more absolute than any raised voice could have been. Then Daichi told him what was going to happen. Not angrily. Not dramatically. The way a person reads a document aloud, clearly and without embellishment. Every board position. Every share. Every access. Every door that had opened because of the Nakamura name would now be closed. Legal proceedings were already in motion. The lawyers had been briefed the previous morning. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Ryosuke, who had gone the color of old paper, and said one final thing. He said that the worst part was not what Ryosuke had done to him. The worst part was a 3-year-old boy picking up a phone because he still believed his daddy was simply somewhere waiting to come home. Then he walked out into the cold night, and he kept walking until he was standing on a narrow, familiar street looking through warm yellow glass at a small bakery where the lights were still on. He stood outside for a long time. Long enough for the cold to settle into his coat. Long enough to watch Sora sitting on the counter eating a bread roll and swinging his legs and being exactly himself, exactly the same, as if no time had passed at all, as if the world inside that glass was sealed and protected from everything that had happened outside it. Then Sora looked up. And across the glass and the distance and the entire broken year between them, those round dark eyes went enormous. The door opened with a sound like a small bell and something much larger. Forgiveness does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like morning, so slowly and so quietly that you do not notice it happening until you are already standing inside it. Haruto did not forgive Daichi that night. He did not forgive him the next day or the day after that or the day after that. What he did instead was something much harder and much more honest than forgiveness. He stayed present. He kept his eyes open. He watched without deciding, which for a man who had spent a year building walls with the same careful hands he used to build bread, was an act of extraordinary courage that nobody around him fully understood except Fumiya, who said nothing and simply ordered an extra coffee on the mornings he came in and found Daichi already sitting in the corner. Because Daichi came back. Not with grand speeches. Not with flowers that would have felt like a transaction. He came back the way water finds its level, steadily, without announcement, adjusting himself to whatever space was offered without demanding more of it. He arrived each morning before the first customers and sat at the corner table with one coffee and did not ask for anything. He did not hover near the counter. He did not try to catch Haruto's eye with the practiced intention of someone performing remorse. He simply existed in the space quietly, the way a person does when they understand that their presence is something that must be earned back one ordinary moment at a time. Sora had no such complications. Sora was 3 years old and his emotional architecture was built entirely on the present tense. Daichi was here. That was the complete and sufficient fact. On the second morning, Sora climbed down from the red chair, walked across the bakery with the serious focused energy of someone on an important errand, and placed a drawing on Daichi's table. It was a drawing of 3 figures of wildly inconsistent sizes standing in front of a yellow rectangle that was meant to be the bakery. Sora pointed at the largest figure and said that one is Daddy, pointed at the medium figure and said that one is Papa, pointed at the smallest figure and said that one is me and I am wearing my blue shoes. Daichi looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked at Sora. Then he said it was the best drawing he had ever seen and he meant it completely. Sora nodded as if this was the expected response and went back to his red chair. Haruto had watched this from behind the counter with a cloth in his hands that he had stopped using and an expression that he could not quite organize into something neutral fast enough before Fumiya, standing beside him, noticed it. Fumiya did not say anything. He simply took the cloth from Haruto's hands and started wiping down the counter himself, and the gentleness of that small action was somehow the thing that made Haruto have to look away. The days continued. They accumulated the way days do, one pressed against the next, and inside that accumulation small things happened that were not dramatic and were not designed to be noticed but were, in their quiet persistence, the actual substance of what was changing. Daichi noticed the leg of the corner table wobbled. He came in one morning with a small toolkit that he had bought without mentioning it to anyone and fixed the wobble in 10 minutes and then put the toolkit behind the counter without being asked in case it was useful later. Haruto found it there 2 days afterward and stood looking at it for longer than a toolkit warranted. The oven made a grinding sound one evening just before closing. Haruto had been monitoring it anxiously for 2 weeks, budgeting in his head, calculating whether he could manage the repair cost without touching the savings he kept for Sora's future. He mentioned it to no one. He was good at managing things alone. He had become very good at it. The following morning a repair technician arrived at 7 before opening, and fixed the grinding in 40 minutes and left without presenting a bill. Haruto stood in his bakery in his white apron with the flour stain near the pocket and looked at the oven and then looked at Daichi sitting in the corner with his coffee and said quietly that he did not ask for that. Daichi said he knew. He said it needed fixing. He looked back at his coffee. Haruto stood there for another moment. Then he went back to the dough. But something in the set of his shoulders was fractionally different than it had been before, and Fumiya, who noticed everything about Haruto with the attention of someone who had been paying it for 6 years, noted it and said nothing and felt something careful and hopeful settle in his chest. What Haruto was fighting was not the absence of feeling. That would have been simpler. What Haruto was fighting was the presence of it, the fact that the feeling had never actually left, that it had simply been placed in a locked room that he had furnished with all the evidence of his own survival and walked past every day without opening. The bakery was proof he was fine. Sora's laugh was proof he was fine. The regulars who knew his name and the bread that came out right every morning and the small red chair in the corner were all proof that he had built something real and whole from the rubble of what had been taken from him. None of that proof stopped being true. But it also did not stop being true that when Daichi helped Sora color inside the lines of a dinosaur page and Sora leaned his whole small body trustingly against Daichi's arm, something in the locked room knocked. One evening after the last customer had gone and Sora was asleep on the small cot in the back room that Haruto had set up for slow afternoons and late closes, Daichi asked if they could talk. Just talk. He said it simply, without pressure, in the tone of someone making a request they are fully prepared to have declined. Haruto looked at him for a moment. Then he untied his apron and folded it over the counter and sat down at the table across from Daichi and said okay. Daichi talked. He did not perform it. He did not build toward anything or construct a case for himself. He laid it out the way you empty a bag you have been carrying too long, item by item, without commentary. The photos, Ryosuke, the investigator, the metadata, the actor and the contract and the traced accounts. The dinner and the folder and the words he had said in the restaurant in the low even voice that had not required any volume because it was already the heaviest thing in the room. He said the name of every piece of it and then he stopped. Then he said the thing that cost him the most, which was not the explanation and not the evidence and not even the apology. What cost him the most was the admission that came after all of it. He said that even if Ryosuke had not existed, even if no one had handed him a lie, he had been a person who was ready to believe it. He had loved Haruto and still carried inside himself the old broken belief that love was a temporary condition, that good things were on loan, that the person who mattered most would eventually confirm the fear by leaving. Ryosuke had handed him a story and he had accepted it because it matched the one he had already been telling himself in the dark. He said he was not asking Haruto to carry that. He said he was telling him because Haruto deserved the whole truth, not just the version that made Daichi look like only a victim of circumstance. He said he was sorry in the way that meant I understand what I cost you and I am not asking you to make it smaller than it was. The bakery was very quiet. Outside the narrow street was settling into its nighttime version. A few lights, a distant sound, the particular stillness of a neighborhood that goes to sleep early. Haruto sat with everything Daichi had said. He let it exist in the room without rushing to respond to it. He had learned this, the sitting with things in the year of being alone. He had learned that not everything needed an immediate answer and that some things needed to be held for a moment before they could be understood. Then he said what had been true for a long time, which was that the hardest nights had not been the ones where he was angry. Anger had been functional. Anger had given him energy and direction and something to push against. The hardest nights had been the ones after the anger passed and there was nothing left but the shape of what was missing, the specific empty weight of an absence that had a name and a face and a habit of leaving origami cranes on a bakery counter before the shop opened each morning. He said that Sora had asked about Daichi at least once a week every week for the entire year. He said he had told the same gentle lie each time, that Daichi was on a long trip, that some trips just took longer than expected. He said the morning Sora stopped asking, which was about 8 weeks before the voice note, had been one of the worst mornings of the whole year because a 3-year-old stopping asking meant a 3-year-old had started accepting, and no child should have to accept that before they can even read their own name. Daichi sat with that. He did not try to speak through it. After a long moment Haruto said that Daichi could not simply come back to him. He said that what he might be willing to consider, eventually, was Daichi coming back to Sora first, earning that back with patience and consistency and the understanding that a child's trust once confused is not repaired by a single morning of colored dinosaur pages. He said if Daichi could do that, if he could show up for Sora the way Sora had always deserved, then maybe the rest of it could be a conversation that happened later, slowly, with both of them keeping their eyes open and their words honest. Daichi said he understood completely. He said he would take whatever form of presence was permitted and he would not ask for more than was offered. Haruto looked at him for one long quiet moment. Then he stood up and went to make 2 cups of tea, which was not a dramatic gesture and was not meant to be, but which was, for Haruto, the specific and deliberate act of a person who has decided to let someone stay a little longer in a space they had not been sure they would ever let anyone back into. They drank the tea without talking very much. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are no longer pretending and who have found that the truth, even when it is heavy, is easier to breathe around than the careful version. In the weeks that followed, Daichi learned that Sora's favorite dinosaur changed every single week with complete conviction and no acknowledgement of the previous week's favorite. He learned that Sora required his bread cut into triangles and not squares, a distinction he treated as non-negotiable. He learned that Sora was afraid of the drain in the bathtub and that the solution Haruto had found was a small rubber duck placed directly over it, which Sora found completely acceptable. He learned these things by being present, by showing up, by treating each small piece of information as the significant thing it was. Haruto watched all of it and said nothing and felt the locked room door open by degrees, not all at once, not with ceremony, simply with the gradual and undeniable logic of something that had always been true reasserting itself gently against everything that had been built to contain it. On a Saturday in early spring Sora turned 4. The bakery was closed for the afternoon. There were paper decorations that Sora had helped hang, which meant they were at varying heights and several were upside down. There was a cake that was slightly lopsided because Sora had insisted on helping frost it. There were 3 other children from the street and their parents and Fumiya, who had brought a gift that was almost entirely wrapping paper and a very small toy inside, and who sat in the corner with his coffee looking at everything with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a thing they had been hoping for long enough that hope had started to feel like stubbornness. Sora was wearing a pointed birthday hat. He was running from one end of the bakery to the other with no discernible purpose. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the room and turned around and located Haruto and Daichi standing at opposite ends of the counter and looked at them with the focused executive energy of a child with a plan. He walked to Haruto. He took his hand. He walked to Daichi. He took his hand. He walked himself backward until he had pulled them both to the center of the room and stood between them still holding both their hands and looked up at the person taking the photo and said very seriously, "Stand here for the photo, daddies." The person with the camera laughed and raised it. Haruto looked down at Sora first, at this small round-faced serious wonderful person who had, with a single voice note on a rainy morning, done what no amount of adult reasoning or careful planning or deliberate distance had managed to do. Then he looked up at Daichi. Daichi was already looking at him. Not with hope, not with expectation, with something quieter and more durable than either of those things. With the look of a person who has stopped trying to deserve something and started trying simply to be worthy of the work it takes to rebuild it. Haruto felt the locked room door swing open the rest of the way. He did not announce it. He simply let it happen, standing in a lopsided decorated bakery with frosting on his apron and his son's warm hand in his and the particular quality of afternoon light that comes in early spring like a reminder that seasons do in fact change. He said quietly without looking away, that Daichi should not make him regret it. Daichi said he would spend as long as necessary making sure he did not. Sora said "Smile daddies" in the voice of someone who had been waiting long enough, and the camera clicked and the moment was kept. It was not the ending of anything. It was the beginning of something that had no name yet, something that would be built slowly and maintained carefully and chosen every day by two people who now understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from losing something completely, that love is not a feeling that arrives and stays without effort. Love is a door you have to keep choosing to open. And sometimes, when you have forgotten where the door is or convinced yourself it no longer exists, a 3-year-old boy picks up a phone and reminds you exactly where you left it. If this story sat with you, if it reminded you of something you have been holding or someone you have been missing or a door you have not let yourself stand in front of yet, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling us which moment stayed with you the longest. And if you are here for the next story, make sure you are subscribed because the next one begins exactly where you least expect it.